to break him. They wanted to see him bend. And though James was weary, though the years had worn him thin, he vowed silently into the dark he would never bend. Not while Alana still needed him. The weeks stretched into months, each one marked by the steady rhythm of medicine bottles emptied and refilled. James moved through his days like a soldier on a long march, step after step, never pausing to think too far ahead. He rose at dawn, tended the house, cooked simple meals, and kept the truck running just enough to make the pharmacy trips. His world had shrunk to the size of Alana's smile and the silence of his porch. To outsiders, he was a shadow of the man he used to be. Once, James had been a fixture of the town, the tall black veteran who rumbled down Main Street on his Harley, who nodded politely to strangers but commanded a quiet respect wherever he went. Without the bike, that presence seemed diminished in their eyes. They didn't see the strength it took to wake every morning, knowing whispers waited for him in the street. They didn't see how his back straightened, even when the weight of judgment pressed down. They only saw a man who had given something up, and they mistook sacrifice for weakness. The hardest part was pretending it didn't matter. At the diner, men laughed louder when he walked past. At the post office, women exchanged looks over his shoulder as if he were deaf. Even the pastor at church, a man who should have known better, offered pitying smiles instead of true fellowship. James bore it all in silence. He spoke to no one about the sting of those daily cuts. Not to his old war buddies, who had long since moved away or buried themselves in their own struggles. Not to his neighbors who never knocked on his door. And certainly not to Alana, whose world needed protection from every bit of ugliness he could shield her from. Instead, he carried it inside. At night, when the house grew quiet, the silence was deafening. He'd sit in his recliner, the television flickering faintly, and his mind would wander. He thought about the war, about foxholes and rain and the men he'd lost. Back then, silence had been heavy too, but it had meant something different. It had been the pause between mortar fire, the stillness before dawn raids. Silence had been dangerous, but it had also been purposeful. Here it felt like suffocation. Sometimes he'd imagine the Harley still parked in the shed. He'd close his eyes and remember the feel of the handlebars, the growl of the engine under him, the freedom of the open road. The memories were sharp, so vivid they almost hurt. That machine had been more than steel and chrome. It had been his voice, his statement that he was still here, still alive, still his own man. Now the shed was empty, and so was a part of him. Still, James did not regret, not once. Every time Alana's laughter rang through the house, every time she ran to hug him with her thin arms, every time he saw the medicine working its quiet miracle, he knew the trade had been worth it. If he had to give up 1,000 Harleys, he would. But sacrifice had a cost, and his came in silence. One Saturday evening, while he was fixing supper, the doorbell rang. When James opened it, he found Carl Jenkins standing on the porch, grinning wide. "Well, if it ain't the man of the hour," Carl said. "Mind if I step in?" James blocked the doorway with his frame. "What do you want, Carl?" Carl shrugged. "Just thought I'd check in on you. Heard you been keeping to yourself. Ain't healthy, you know." James didn't move. He could smell the whiskey on Carl's breath. "You know," Carl went on, leaning against the doorframe, "I've been telling folks you should have kept that Harley. At least then you'd have something worth respecting. Now, well," he let the sentence hang in the air like bait. James's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Carl smirked. "Don't worry. Ain't no shame in being what you are. Some men just ain't built to hold on." Before James could respond, Alana's small voice called from the kitchen. "Grandpa? Who is it?" Carl's smirk widened. He tipped an imaginary hat. "Evening, little miss." James's chest tightened. "Go on inside, baby girl," he said gently, never taking his eyes off Carl. Alana hesitated, then retreated. James stepped forward, his voice low and even. "Don't come to my door again." Carl's grin faltered for just a second, but he recovered with a laugh. "Touchy, touchy. All right, Carter. Just remember, you can't hide forever." He sauntered down the steps and disappeared into the night. James closed the door and stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly until the heat in his chest cooled. He wouldn't let Alana see him angry. He wouldn't give Carl that satisfaction. Later that night, after Alana was asleep, James sat at the table staring at his calloused hands. He thought about what Carl had said, about respect, about holding on. It struck him how easily men like Carl confused noise with strength, possession with pride. They didn't understand that sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was let go. He rubbed his temples and whispered to the empty room, "You don't know a damn thing about me." Silence answered, as it always did. Yet even in the stillness, there was one truth James could hold to. He wasn't doing this for the town. He wasn't doing this to prove anything to men like Carl. He was doing it for Alana. And for her, he could endure every whisper, every smirk, every silent night. The struggle was his alone to carry, and he would carry it, silently until the end. Word has a way of traveling, especially in small towns. Whispers turn into stories, and stories take on a life of their own. James Carter's sacrifice, selling the Harley, he loved more than anything he owned, had been twisted and retold a dozen different ways before it reached the county line. At the feed store, old men said he'd been forced to sell, that he couldn't keep up with payments. At the gas station, teenagers laughed that the old black vet got swindled. By the time the tale reached the next town over, some said James had lost the bike in a bet. The truth, that he had given up his Harley willingly, so his granddaughter could live, wasn't the version people wanted to believe. It was easier for them to mock a man than to honor him. But truth has a strange way of surviving. Somewhere between the bar stools and back porches, James's real story slipped free. It began with Mr. Rodriguez, the pharmacist. He had seen James walk in, place a wad of bills on the counter, and ask quietly for the life-saving medicine. Rodriguez had watched the pride in the man's face as he carried the bag out the door. A week later, when a biker stopped in his store to pick up aspirin, Rodriguez shared what he had witnessed. "You ever hear of James Carter?" he asked. The biker shook his head. "Well," Rodriguez said, lowering his voice, "he sold the one thing he loved most in the world. Sold his Harley, an old beauty, must have been 20 years under his care. Did it just to keep his granddaughter alive?" The biker listened, his brows furrowed. He knew the kind of bond men had with their machines. A Harley wasn't just a bike. It was an extension of the soul. To let one go like that, well, it meant something. By the time he left, the story had burned into his memory. That night, he passed it on at a roadside bar, and another rider passed it on after that. Within 2 weeks, it had moved through a web of biker circles, crossing state lines like wildfire, and it finally landed in the ears of a chapter of the HELLS Angels. They were gathered at their clubhouse one night, engines cooling outside, the smell of leather, beer, and gasoline thick in the air. "Y'all hear about that vet in Alabama?" one of the younger members asked. "What vet?" grunted Big Mike, a broad-shouldered man with arms like steel pipes. "The black guy, Vietnam vet, sold his Harley so his granddaughter could get her medicine." The room quieted. For bikers, the Harley wasn't just transportation. It was identity, family, freedom. Selling one was like cutting off a limb. "You sure that's true?" another asked. Pharmacist told it straight. Fella didn't hesitate, just laid the money down. The men sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of it. Finally, Big Mike slammed his hand on the table. "That ain't right." "What ain't right?" someone asked. "That a man like that should suffer in silence. He gave up everything for family. That kind of sacrifice deserves respect." Heads nodded. Around the table, respect was their language, their code. And this man, this James Carter, had earned more than whispers and mockery. One of them pulled out his phone, searching for more details. Bit by bit, they pieced together the truth. His service in Vietnam, the granddaughter he was raising alone, the racism he faced daily in that town. By the end of the night, they had made up their minds. "We're riding out," Big Mike said. "Man like that deserves to know he ain't alone. If his own people won't stand with him, then we will." Back in James's town, life went on much the same. He tended his house, watched over Alana, and ignored the whispers. If he suspected that his story was moving far beyond the county, he didn't show it. One evening, as he sat on the porch sipping coffee, he heard the faint rumble of engines in the distance. He thought little of it. Bikers often passed through on the highway, but the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, closer. Alana came running out. "Grandpa, do you hear that?" He smiled faintly. "Sounds like a parade of Harleys." She giggled. but the sound kept swelling until even James's calm demeanor began to shift. This wasn't too